Hey there. Ready to dive into a pretty transformative period in modern history. We're talking about the events that led up to the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, it's fascinating because early 20th century Russia was like caught between two worlds.
Right.
This massive empire with
Right.
all this richness and tradition, but also struggling to keep up with Europe's industrialization and social change.
It's kind of mind-boggling to think about the scale of it.
Yeah.
You've got Russia in 1914 stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific.
Right.
And it wasn't just big geographically, it's incredibly diverse, with religions and ethnicities and languages all under Tsar Nicholas II.
And that diversity, while it was a source of, richness in many ways,
Yeah.
also added to the tensions that would eventually lead to the revolution.
Right.
You see, unlike lots of other European nations, Russia's economy was still really tied to agriculture.
Right.
Over 85% of the population worked on farms,
Wow.
and industrialization was much slower there compared to the West.
So you can already see where things might start to go wrong.
Yeah,
You've got this more traditional agricultural society clashing with the beginnings of industrialization and modernization.
exactly. And within that dynamic, you've got these deep social divisions.
Like what kind of divisions?
Well, think about the millions of peasants who wanted to own land, the growing number of factory workers facing terrible conditions and low wages in these new industrial centers,
Right.
and just this rising tide of discontent with the Tsar's autocratic rule.
You can almost picture the contrast. Like
Oh.
the Tsar's opulent winter palace in St. Petersburg as a symbol of absolute power
Oh, yeah.
compared to the cramped and often unsanitary living conditions of the workers.
Exactly. It's a visual representation of the inequality brewing under the surface.
And within all this unrest, new ideas started to gain traction, like socialism, which offered economic equality and social justice.
Yeah, it was a compelling alternative to the Tsarist regime, especially for those who felt marginalized.
But socialism in Russia wasn't just one unified movement, right? You had all these different socialist groups, each with their own way of bringing about change.
Yeah, it was like this political chess game with each group trying to outmaneuver the others and win the support of the people.
One of the key differences seems to be between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks.
Exactly.
The Mensheviks wanted a slower, more democratic path to socialism, whereas the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, were all about swiftly taking power through a tightly controlled party.
Think of the Mensheviks as the reformists and the Bolsheviks as the revolutionaries.
It must have been so exciting, but also dangerous to be a part of these movements back then.
Yeah, imagine those secret meetings dodging the Tsar's secret police.
Passing around forbidden socialist books.
It's like something out of a spy thriller.
Right.
And these weren't just theoretical debates either.
What do you mean?
Well, in 1905, Russia had a taste of revolution, a kind of dress rehearsal, you could say.
Oh, wow.
It all started with Bloody Sunday, this horrific event where a peaceful demonstration of workers asking the Tsar for better conditions was met with gunfire from his troops.
That's awful.
It was a turning point.
I can't imagine the outrage after Bloody Sunday.
Yeah, it wasn't just about ideas anymore. It was a violent clash that exposed the Tsarist regime's brutality and triggered strikes and protests all over Russia.
So it wasn't just men leading the charge, right? Women were also involved?
Exactly. Women played a crucial role in the 1905 uprising, particularly during the International Women's Day protests.
And this kind of foreshadowed their significance in the later revolution.
Absolutely. It showed their bravery and determination in fighting for change.
So faced with this crisis, the Tsar had to make some concessions right. Wasn't the Duma created around that time?
Yeah, the Duma was kind of like a parliament, but here's the thing.
What?
The Tsar didn't really want to share power. He kept undermining the Duma's authority, dissolving it whenever they challenged him.
Talk about trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Right, and that just fueled more resentment among the people.
Well, the revolution was basically inevitable at that point.
You could say the seeds had been sown, but it would take another event, a global one, to really bring those seeds to life, and that event was World War I.
Oh boy,
Yeah, things are about to get a lot more complicated.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, buckle up.
Okay.
We're heading into some really turbulent times.
Okay, so we left off with Russia on the verge of change.
Mhm.
Those social and economic tensions we talked about were just bubbling under the surface. And then World War I breaks out and, well, things escalate pretty quickly.
Yeah, you could say World War I was like a pressure cooker for all those simmering tensions. At first, the war brought a lot of Russians together, this sense of patriotism,
Right.
But that unity didn't last very long. Russia suffered heavy losses on the Eastern Front, And the Tsar's leadership, which was already being questioned, started to look completely incompetent.
And it wasn't just the battles that were taking a toll, right? I mean, the war really devastated everyday life for ordinary Russians.
Absolutely. You had food shortages, inflation, refugees fleeing the war zones. It was like the whole country was falling apart.
So basically, the war just made everything worse.
Yeah. And that suffering, combined with the Tsar's failures, completely turned public opinion against him.
Right? All those social divisions we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
they were magnified tenfold by the war.
Exactly. The peasants, the workers, intellectuals, even some people close to the Tsar, they all started losing faith in his leadership.
So it sounds like the revolution was almost inevitable at that point.
The stage was definitely set.
And that revolution finally came in February 1917. What strikes me is that it wasn't some planned coup by a political party.
Right.
It was more like a spontaneous explosion of anger and frustration.
It started with bread riots in Petrograd.
Bread riots.
Yeah, imagine women who were, responsible for feeding their families.
Right.
They're standing in these long lines for bread and the shelves are empty.
That's awful.
So their anger boils over, and pretty soon those bread riots turn into massive strikes. Workers demanding better conditions and an end to the war.
Wow.
And then you have this pivotal moment. The soldiers who are ordered to fire on the protesters, they refuse.
They refused.
Yeah, they lay down their arms and join the crowds. It was a complete collapse of the Tsar's authority.
That must have been incredible to witness.
It was a turning point.
So the Tsar was basically forced to step down.
Yeah, facing all that opposition, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending centuries of Romanov rule.
But the revolution didn't end there, right?
Not at all. In fact, it was just beginning.
So what happened next? Who took charge?
Well, two main centers of power emerged.
Okay.
You had the provisional government made up of liberal politicians who wanted to establish a democracy.
Right.
And then you had the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers.
So basically two groups with very different ideas about what Russia should look like.
Yeah, it was a situation of dual power. Both the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet were trying to assert their authority.
Wow, so you have this tug of war for the future of Russia.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, were watching all of this unfold very carefully.
Lenin, he had just returned from exile, right?
That's right. Lenin was a brilliant strategist, and he saw this power struggle as an opportunity for the Bolsheviks to take control.
So while the provisional government was trying to restore order, the Bolsheviks were planning their next move.
Exactly.
So what was their strategy? How did they plan to win over the people?
Well, they were masters of organization and propaganda, and they really understood what the people wanted.
Right, all those secret meetings and underground networks we talked about.
Exactly. The Bolsheviks were building their support base among factory workers, soldiers, and within the Soviets.
They weren't just talking, they were out there organizing.
Yeah, and their message was simple and powerful. Peace, land, and bread.
Peace, land, and bread.
It perfectly captured the desires of a population that was tired of war, hungry, and landless.
And another one of their slogans was, all power to the Soviets.
Right, appealing to those who saw the Soviets as the true voice of the people.
So they weren't just promising vague ideals, they were offering real solutions.
Exactly. And as the provisional government struggled to deliver, the Bolsheviks' message resonated even more strongly.
It's like they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
And that moment came in October 1917.
October 1917.
The Bolsheviks, led by Leon Trotsky, launched a carefully planned uprising, taking over key government buildings, communication centers, and strategic points in Petrograd.
So they basically overthrew the government in a single night.
It was a swift and decisive takeover.
How did they manage to pull that off? Was there no resistance?
There was some resistance, but the Bolsheviks had timed it perfectly. Prime Minister Kerensky, who was the head of the provisional government, had already left the capital to try and gather troops.
Oh, wow.
But it was too late. The Bolsheviks had control of the streets, and they had the support of key military units to symbolize their victory. They even had the cruiser Aurora fire blank shots at the Winter Palace.
The Winter Palace. Wow, that's an incredible image.
It was a powerful symbol of the changing tides.
And with the provisional government gone, what happened next?
Well, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which was meeting in Petrograd, formally endorsed the Bolshevik takeover.
So this small group of revolutionaries had managed to topple the Tsarist regime and seize control of Russia.
Yeah, it was a remarkable feat.
But what happened next? Did everyone just accept this new Bolshevik regime?
Not quite. It turns out building a new society is a lot more complicated than just taking power, and as we'll see in part 3, the revolution wasn't over. It was really just beginning.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Russian Revolution. So we've gone from Tsarist rule to the Bolsheviks' takeover in October 1917.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about.
Now, the Bolsheviks had accomplished this incredible feat, but their biggest challenge was just starting building a whole new society from scratch.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. The Bolsheviks, who are now the Communist Party, they weren't just idealists, they were also very practical. And they knew that Russia, after all the war and turmoil, couldn't just become a pure communist state overnight.
So what did they do?
They implemented something called the New Economic Policy, or NEP.
The NEP.
Yeah, it was a kind of strategic retreat, a way to allow some limited private enterprise alongside state control of key industries.
So basically a mix of socialism and capitalism.
Exactly. It was meant to help the economy recover to get things back on track after all the chaos.
It sounds like they were willing to compromise on some of their core beliefs.
It was a pragmatic move, and, it did cause some internal conflicts within the party.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Some hardliners saw it as a betrayal of the revolution, but others, including Lenin, argued that it was necessary to build a strong economic base for the future.
I guess it makes sense when you think about it. Those early years after the revolution must have been incredibly challenging.
Absolutely. They were trying to put these revolutionary ideals into practice in a country that was still reeling from all the upheaval.
So the NEP was kind of a way to buy them some time.
You could say that, but then things got even more complicated after Lenin's death in 1924.
What happened?
A power struggle broke out within the Communist Party, and Joseph Stalin, a very shrewd and ruthless politician, emerged as the new leader.
Stalin? Yeah, he's a pretty infamous figure.
That's right. Stalin's leadership marked a big shift from Lenin's more pragmatic approach.
In what way?
Well, Stalin was much more ideologically driven, and he wasn't afraid to use brutal force to get what he wanted. He abandoned the NEP and launched a series of 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the country and collectivize agriculture.
And collectivization was that policy of forcing peasants onto those large state-run farms.
Right.
Exactly. Stalin believed that small, privately owned farms were holding back progress, so he launched this campaign to eliminate them.
And it was a brutal campaign, right?
Absolutely. Millions of people were uprooted from their homes, families were torn apart, land and livestock were confiscated, and many people were deported to remote regions.
It's hard to imagine the suffering that caused.
It was a terrible period, and the resistance to collectivization was met with extreme violence. Millions of people were killed or imprisoned, and the disruption to agriculture led to a devastating famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s.
That's just heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter in Soviet history.
And Stalin's reign of terror didn't stop there, right?
Unfortunately not. He created a totalitarian state where the government controlled every aspect of people's lives. Dissent was crushed through purges, show trials, and a vast network of secret police. Millions of people were sent to forced labor camps in Siberia just for expressing the wrong opinions.
It sounds like something out of a nightmare.
It was a very dark time, but it's important to remember that the Soviet Union also made significant progress in some areas under Stalin's rule. It underwent rapid industrialization, becoming a major military power, and it made advances in science and technology.
So it's a very complicated legacy.
Yeah, you have the undeniable achievements, but also the horrific human costs.
A lot to grapple with.
And then there's the global impact of the Russian Revolution to consider. Remember how the Bolsheviks wanted to inspire similar revolutions around the world?
Right. Did they succeed?
Well, the Russian Revolution definitely had a huge impact globally. It inspired communist and socialist movements in many countries, and the creation of the Comintern in 1919 was meant to coordinate these movements.
So the revolution was a model for others who wanted to overthrow oppressive regimes.
Absolutely. But it also generated a lot of fear and opposition in the West, particularly in the United States, which saw the Soviet Union as a dangerous threat.
Right. The Cold War was a direct result of that fear and mistrust.
Exactly. And that struggle between the Soviet Union and the West shaped global politics for decades.
It's incredible how one event could have such far-reaching consequences.
It really shows you the power of ideas and how history can have a ripple effect across the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Russian Revolution, I'm left with this sense of awe at the sheer scale and complexity of it all. It's a story full of ambition, idealism, brutality, and resilience.
It really makes you think.
It does. And what stands out to you most from this journey through history?
I think it's the enduring human desire for a better world that really shines through. Even amidst all the tragedy and turmoil of the Russian Revolution, people were striving for a more just and equitable society. And that's something that still resonates with us today.
It's a powerful message.
and a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's still shaping our world today. Thank you for joining me on this incredible exploration of the Russian Revolution. Until next time.